Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 33 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises on the comfortable drawing room of a grand apartment off the Ringstrasse in Vienna. It is December 1899, at the close of one century and the beginning of another. The room is buzzing with the talk and activity of a large family come together at Christmas time. Children are decorating the tree. A carol is being played on the piano. Coffee and cake are being taken. The women gossip and the men argue about politics. What is notable about this prosperous extended family as they celebrate Christmas is that they are, in fact, of Jewish descent. Two of the adults have intermarried, including the head of this household, Hermans, who is also converted to Catholicism. Herman is a very successful industrialist who is keen to assimilate himself and his family into fin de siècle Viennese society. What follows is a family saga that charts the vicissitudes of Herman and his descendants through the turbulent history of the first half of the 20th century, a period which encompasses the cataclysmic decline of the Austro-Hungarian Empire through the First World War, to the horrors of the Anschluss in 1938 and the concentration camps that followed. This is Leopoldstadt, Tom Stoppard's ambitious new play, which opened in London's West End in January 2020, only to be prematurely closed by the first pandemic lockdown a few weeks later, but which happily has been revived for another run this autumn. The play takes its title from the name of the district in Vienna and is a sweeping work of history and ideas which addresses profound moral questions of identity and prejudice that are insistently relevant. It is both intellectually stimulating and piercingly poignant. Tom Stoppard is, of course, one of the most acclaimed and prolific playwrights of our time, renowned for his wit and intellectual brilliance in plays such as Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, The Real Inspector Hound, Jumpers, Travesties, Arcadia, The Coast of Utopia, and The Hard Problem, to name a selected few. Written as he approached the age of 80, Leopoldstadt is not only a towering intellectual and structural achievement, it is also a very personal play, based in some part on Stoppard's own fascinating family history, more of which in due course. I'm very privileged to be joined by my guest on the podcast today, Patrick Marber, the director of the London productions of Leopoldstadt, who is uniquely qualified to share her insights into this wonderfully rich play and Tom Stoppard's work, having also recently directed Travesties in London and New York. In addition to an acclaimed career as a director, in fact, listeners may know Patrick primarily as a playwright in his own right, being the author of a dozen plays, including Dealer's Choice, Closer, and The Red Lion, as well as adaptations of plays by Strindberg, Molière, Turgenev, and Ibsen. He's also a screenwriter, adapting his own play Closer into the 2004 film directed by Mike Nichols, as well as screenplays for Asylum and Notes on a Scandal. Welcome, Patrick. Thanks very much for joining me.
Hello to you.
Hello. You obviously enjoyed a successful partnership with Sir Tom working on Travesties. So my first question is, what is it about his work and this play in particular that drew you to want to direct Leopoldstadt?
Well, I would have directed any new play that Tom wrote. I was just privileged to be asked to direct it. I knew a little bit about it before I read it, and Tom very charmingly offered it to me, saying, you don't have to do it if you don't like it or don't want to. But I would have done it even if I didn't like it. But fortunately, I loved it. I've always been fascinated by Tom's work from when I first encountered Travesties as a schoolboy. Some sixth form boys did a production of the play. I was about 14, and I didn't really understand it, but I loved it and got some energy from it and vibration from it that immediately sent me into reading the text, which I still didn't understand or quite get. But over the years, I've seen all of Tom's work, and I studied him at university. He was a hero of mine. And I met him in 1995 when my first play was on at the National. That was Dealer's Choice, and Tom was on the board of the National and said very nice things about the play, and was equally kind about Closer. And we became, I suppose, chums, and would have the odd lunch and bump into each other, and always very warmly. He gave me some notes on my third play, Howard Katz, and we've just stayed in touch, seen each other's work. The way Travesties came about was Tom phoned me to ask me about a director called Sam West, who the Chocolate Factory had offered Travesties to direct. I thought Tom was phoning to offer me Travesties, but he wasn't. He was phoning to ask me about the director. And I said to him, look, Sam West is an excellent director. I'd work with him. He directed a revival of Dealer's Choice. Very good guy, perfect director for Travesties. And I said, but if for some reason he's not available, because Sam's an actor too, I said, please consider my hat in the ring. 2 weeks of silence. And then I got a call from David Babani at the Chocolate Factory who said, all right, Sam can't do it. Do you want to do it? And I said, yes, of course I do. Let me read the play again. Sat down, read the play, still didn't understand it, but said yes all the same. And then started figuring out what was going on in this play and how the hell to do it. And I took quite a sweep at Travesties and staged it quite radically, but it worked, and it was a big hit for him. And, you know, we took it from the Chocolate Factory to the West End to Broadway. I think my loyalty to the play really impressed him. I kept with it in all its iterations in the manner that I would want a director to keep with one of my plays. So I just directed Tom as I like to be directed, which is very closely and with great attention to detail. And he was in the room as much or as little as he wanted to be. And that was quite a new experience for him to always be there and to be asked all the time what he thought.
Mm.
And he kind of liked it. And then I think when he found himself writing a Jewish play, I was in line for the role of director because I'd just done Travesties and I was a Jew. So I was in the right place at the right time.
So what was it about the play itself, though, from your point of view, that you thought, yes, I don't know whether you understood it like Travesties or not, but you just, as you say, you would have done anything he asked you possibly. But
yeah,
what was it particularly, you think, initially about the play?
Well, I was very moved by it. You know, by the time I got to the end, I just knew I had to deliver this play. I thought it was an important play, a big play, an ambitious play, possibly Tom's last play. And I felt I knew who these people were in the play. I understood them from the page. And there were scenes in it where I just thought, that's going to work, that's going to work, that's going to work. Oh, that's a bit difficult.
Yeah.
That's difficult. So there was a good balance of challenge and simplicity. And, you know, it's not every day you get sent a play with about 30 or 35 speaking roles in it. And it was an exciting opportunity. Speaking
of the challenge, yeah, 30 to 35 speaking roles. I read that you said once that you treat a new play like a classic and a classic like a new play. Now, this play and production, I don't know whether I'm quoting you correctly, but feel very much like a classic already. So I'm really interested in what you meant by that, if that's what you said.
Well, no, it's what they used to say at the Royal Court. That was the dictum of the court in the 50s. And I always thought that was a brilliant statement about how to treat plays. And so, yes, I treated Tom's play like a classic, that it should be directed with respect and dutiful adherence to what the playwright intended, and didn't require too much directorial intervention. I mean, I did intervene every now and then, certainly musically, and some of the staging surprised Tom a little bit, but fundamentally I directed what he wrote. Though he did change the play over, by the time we got to rehearsal, we I was probably rehearsing the third draft of the play by then.
Actually, just responding to what you're saying, I think there's a real sense of, I don't know, it's not traditional necessarily, but it's just a reverence for what the play is and its setting and the language that doesn't need tricks. It's all there for you. So I guess maybe that's something to do with how you treat a classic. I wanted to ask you about the title of the play. I mentioned that Leopoldstadt is an area of Vienna, but it wasn't familiar to me. And I wondered what the significance of this area is and why you thought Sir Tom used it as a title for the play.
Yeah, Leopoldstadt wasn't the original title.
Ah.
And Sonia and I didn't like the original title.
Are you going to tell us what the original title was?
I don't know whether I should. I don't know whether Tom's on the record with that.
Okay.
But it had a different title. And we got quite close to the wire for announcing the play. And I was in Tom's kitchen one day, and we still didn't have a title. We had some possibles, but none that we felt was it. And I said, why don't we call it after the Jewish area of Vienna? How would that be? And he said, Leopoldstadt. And I said, yes. And we both went, well, that's not a commercial title, but it is the right title. And we told Sonia, we're calling it, it's called Leopoldstadt. And she said, great, thanks for that. A title people can't pronounce, that always works.
Yeah.
But it was right because it's the area of Vienna where the Jews first moved to. I mean, I'm talking about in the 16th century, and were then purged from there. I mean, the strange irony of Leopoldstadt is that Leopoldstadt is an area of Vienna named after Leopold I, the emperor, who purged the city of its Jews. And the population was so pleased that they decided to name the formerly Jewish area Leopoldstadt. So the title contains within it a pogrom, a persecution, an initial first blast at the Jews by the Emperor of Austria. This seemed to us good. And also it's where Hermann Merz, the sort of protagonist of Leopoldstadt, has escaped from. Him and his family arrived in Leopoldstadt from Russia and then got out, made some money and got out, in the same way that English Jews arrived in the East End, Whitechapel, got out to Essex or Hendon or Barnet or beyond. You gravitate to where the Jews are, and then you get rich if you're a certain kind of Jew, and you get the hell out. It's a sort of Jewish tradition.
So despite its uncommercial title, it works in terms of representing a lot of what the play is trying to say in terms of the history.
It completely works. It's a place, but it's also a state of mind. It's a place to arrive at and escape from. There's a line in the play where Ludwig, the mathematician, refers to his own family back in Galicia as being people who live with their bags packed. And that's really one of the great motifs of the play. So that when we get to 1938, the whole family have their bags packed.
Yeah.
And they're ready to go. And it's powerful. And of course, now we think of Afghanistan and the plight of refugees globally.
Yeah. Yeah. And it signifies, I think by naming, you're saying that changing history of the area, it seems to signify discrimination as well, right? Because it's labeled as a Jewish area, but then you've already talked about the irony of that label.
Yeah.
We started straying into some of the details. So I usually like to give listeners who haven't seen or read the play yet, Patrick, a brief overview of what happens so they have a better idea of what we're talking about. I realize that this isn't easy, as I've said, that it covers 4 generations of family, taking us from 1899 to 1955, and as you've already said, also a huge cast of characters. But given our time restraints, I would just interested if you could be able to give us a brief overview of what happens in the play, what the structure of it is, who these main characters are.
Yeah, it's painfully simple structurally. Here is a vast extended family. Here is life. And by the time we get to the end, there's 3 left. That's the play. The play is from the many to the few. And all this life and all this stuff is gone.
Wow.
And in the last scene of the play, there are three characters, two of whom are scrambling to reclaim a painting, a Klimt, that is a big part of the plot in 1899 and 1900. And it's like a sacred totem of the family. And I end the production with that painting when the audience are leaving, as if to say, maybe they'll get it back. It's a slight uptick at the end.
But it's interesting to talk about coming from a start with such wealth. That the opening scenes are set in 1899 in Vienna, and it's obviously a prosperous time. And Fin de siècle, Vienna is a prosperous place. It's the massive empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and also culturally rich, isn't it? The place of Haydn and Mozart, Beethoven, Mahler, Klimt, as you said, who painted the paintings for the university, but also his famous portraits, and you're talking about the Klimt painting.
Yeah.
So why do you think he chose Vienna as the starting place for this saga, as you say, about from having it all to nothing?
Well, I think because it's the cultural center of Europe at the time, and very welcoming to Jews who prospered and were successful, both in business and the arts. And so the place of the Jew in Viennese society is seemingly solid, not entirely loved, but certainly more than tolerated. And you've got Freud, and you've got Mahler, and you've got Schoenberg and Schnitzler, all working there, all doing their thing. And you feel, well, as Hermann Merz says, this is the promised land.
Yeah.
And his friend Ludwig says, "Oh, don't be so sure." He strikes a cautious note. There's still anti-Semitism. It's still in the blood of the Austrians. Don't you be so confident. And Ludwig is proved right. But, you know, a good playwright sets you up high at the beginning to bring you low. And that's Vienna. Yes.
When I visited Vienna not that long ago, I was so struck by how much it was the center of Europe, in a sense, how the center of gravity was there, the size of the empire, the wealth of it.
Yeah.
And of course, Vienna, as I think someone says in the play, had 600 years of aggregating different peoples. You know, it's sort of a model of the cosmopolitan mix. Therefore, an interesting place to set questions today, because we are dealing with populations that are moving all the time, and immigration into all the cities around the world and the ones we live in, and how we deal with that.
Yeah.
And in fact, the first act of the play in particular starts off with Hermann talking about a debate. There's a debate, isn't there, about the limits of assimilation. He is very interested in how successfully he has assimilating himself, and is determined that will continue. He believes that the Jews can be Austrian, that they are, as you said, generally welcome, can be successful, and that progress, because he sees that there's progress, because there has been, he cites previous discriminations to his ancestors, and says, we are the torchbearers of assimilation. But it's not as straightforward that he's right. And of course, as you said, Ludwig sounds a note of caution. What did you make of the debate, particularly about assimilation, as it unfolds in the play?
Well, one's main concern as a director is how to stage it. It's long speeches, and it's two men talking at a very high Stoppardian level. So to be honest, one is thinking, maybe he could have a drink here and pour the other guy a drink, and then I think I want something in the background happening. How am I going to light this? How do I get this to be intense? This is the climax of the act. The content of it, I didn't worry about before rehearsals, because the speeches are brilliant. What they say is smart and intellectually interesting, but I'm thinking, how do I bring it alive for the audience? Now, with two brilliant actors playing those parts, and the content of what they're talking about feeling so powerfully relevant, it just plays beautifully. It was harder before the pandemic, before Afghanistan, and it was still great, but it felt like they were talking about the past. Now it feels like they're talking about now.
Yes. Well, it's clearly a universal challenge in our diverse societies, isn't it? How do we accommodate our differences? Do people have to become the same?
Yeah.
With or without leaving tradition behind or community behind, as you said, put the bags packed and getting out?
Sure, it's the question.
Yes. And ironically, Herman's argument that, he's being successful at this, he's not so much proving the concept as the opposite. He has to destroy his Jewishness in order to assimilate somehow, doesn't he? Because he converts and leaves behind his family and his ancestors.
That's right, because Tom is great, nothing is simple in this play. So Herman talks like a Jew, he talks about we, but actually he's become a Catholic.
Yeah.
In order to progress as a businessman. And when this slight hypocrisy is pointed out to him, he's alert to it and alive to it. He gets it. It's not perfect, but he says, 50 years ago you couldn't even get a room to stay in, and you had to step off the pavement and doff your cap to an Austrian.
But it's not, as you say, it's a wonderfully rich debate, because there are no simple answers. Ludwig does challenge him, and there's some sense that you're thinking, has Ludwig got the right voice here? Has Herman got it wrong? Well, obviously some circumstances come to play which suggest he may have done, but because Ludwig says something like, assimilation doesn't mean to stop being a Jew. Your incidental effect would be the end of Judaism. Assimilation means carrying on being a Jew without insult. So somehow to live in a society that's possible, that's a question. And it's not something you can choose to leave behind. I thought that was one of the other fascinating points about the play. And Ludwig as well says a Jew can be a great composer, say like Mahler, he can be the toast of the town, but he can't not be a Jew. In the end, if it doesn't catch up on him, it will catch up on his children. While obviously prophetic in many ways. And one of the ironies that comes out, I guess, of this, isn't it, Patrick, is that Herman believes that the progress is going to continue, that they're on a path where it won't matter so much to whether you're Jewish, and that Europe, he actually says Europe has gone past the prejudices of the past, which we all know is absolutely not true by what follows even in the 20th century, let alone what we still see going on around us. So I think that it has some really profound resonances for today still, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's also resonant for the playwright, because there's a line at the end of the play in Act 5, 1955, where Nathan says to Leo, who is the, as it were, young Tom Stoppard character, says, you live without history, you live as if you cast no shadow.
Mm-hmm.
Words to that effect. And that's kind of why Tom wrote the play, because the play is his own personal reckoning with his own past. And this is why the play feels both deeply personal and powerfully historical and sweeping and political. It does both. Its lens can focus on an act of adultery by a beloved wife who is forgiven. It can go right in tight, and it's panorama as well. And that's a facet of Tom's writing always. I mean, Travesties does that as well. You can be, on the one hand, arguing about cucumber sandwiches, and on the other hand, talking about the horrors of the First World War. And there's no contradiction there in Stoppard. He's a maestro of the micro and the macro simultaneously.
Yeah, and I thought that was so true, that the political is made personal in those scenes with, as you mentioned, with Gretel and her adulterous meeting with Fritz, and then the subsequent meeting of Herman and Fritz. So the story there is, the scenes are so beautifully set up that it's not just about the personal, though. It's about how they represent Herman's dream of assimilation and how that is doomed to failure.
Yes.
Can you just share a little bit about how that scene goes, how those scenes go, and how that comes about? That seems to achieve both those things.
Well, it's the second act of the play, set in 1900, and the conclusion of the first act of the play is Herman saying, "Hey, we're assimilated. Progress is inevitable."
Yeah.
His friend says, don't be so sure. The friend is proven right in the next act. Act 2 is structured like La Ronde or Reagan, Schnitzler's play that they're talking about in Act 1. And in Act 2, a series of two-hander scenes, like a daisy chain, progress the action to the climactic scene between Herman and Fritz, his wife's lover. And Herman, for the first time, learns that he's nothing like assimilated.
Yeah.
And that the distinction between the Viennese aristocracy and a businessman Jew is enormous. And that Herman's not going to, there's only so far he can rise. There's only so much he's accepted. And he gets burnt, owned, we might say.
Totally humiliated, really.
Totally humiliated, broken. And then the next scene brilliantly reclaims him on some level as a Jew. He's at the Seder with his family. It's my favorite moment in the play, in a way, is the cut from the end of the scene with Fritz into the Seder scene is a sort of beautiful transition from abject humiliation to the warm welcome of family custom.
He's back into the safety of the world he was trying to leave in some way.
He is. And, you know, of course, Tom being Tom, it isn't Herman who becomes more Jewish during the course of the play. It's the Goyische wife, Gretel,
Yes.
who sort of becomes a big Jew by the end.
Yes.
Which, you know, a normal playwright, a good playwright would have had Herman become more Jewish because of getting owned by this aristocrat. No, not for Tom. It's more complicated than that.
I thought that the scene is actually quite shocking where he gets humiliated by Fritz, because when he, you know, the extent to which he realizes how far away he is, as you've just said, represented particularly by that he seeks to become a member of the Jockey Club.
Yeah.
This is one of the signs that he's made it. And there's a rich aristocrat who has horses who he's financing and helping, and he thinks that's the way into the Jockey Club.
Yeah.
And Fritz, of course, tells him there's no hope in hell you are ever going to be a member of the Jockey Club. That just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And of course, they have the conflict over his wife, who he feels he's being dishonored, Herman. So he challenges Fritz to a duel of all things. But Fritz refuses to fight because it's a rule of the army that they're not allowed to even fight with a Jew. They're below even fighting with.
Yeah.
And he even talks about it that a Jew is devoid of honor at birth. You cannot be insulted. It's really shocking language.
Yeah, it's very, very powerful. And you know, it's the prelude to Anschluss. Here we are, 38 years before Anschluss. And, you know, if you're paying attention, all these pieces of the complicated puzzle that Tom assembles, everything falls into place.
Absolutely. I was thought really interesting at the end of the scene where he says he has been humiliated, but there's some element of recognition about the moralities of what are going on, because he says, God forgive me that I should dine with men like you and think myself raised up in the world. And he goes home and he's welcomed at home, and some part of his integrity perhaps remains. But I was interested, you just talked about the segue into the Seder. Another challenge of the play was we have these scenes of Jewish ritual. So the family coming together for the Seder, and there's the whole next scene, 1924, where it's all surrounds the ritual of circumcision of one of the grandchildren. These are not necessarily that familiar for a mass audience. Well, how did you feel about doing this? What was the significance of these very specific Jewish scenes?
I take a view that I always take a view to trust the intelligence of the audience. I think audiences are much cleverer than we give them credit for sometimes. The collective intelligence of the audience is a joy to behold. The audiences get things and get recapitulations, and they get an idea tossed into the play in 1899 that gets, you know, there's a little bit of chat about cricket in 1899, and cricket is mentioned again in 1955. Tom does this all the time. You sow a little seed early in the play, you grow a little plant a bit later. No, I just trusted the audience would, whether they're Jews or not, they get it. it's some ritual, some ceremony, some Jewish thing that you're either privy to or you're not, but it's not difficult to get.
It establishes a really strong sense of family and tradition based on these shared rituals, doesn't it? And I think that's one of the themes, isn't it, of the strength of family.
Yeah, it's a wonderful moment because you're going back to a Jewish ceremony, the ceremony of Seder, Passover, fleeing the land of Egypt where the Jews were enslaved to the Pharaoh, which is mentioned in the first act of the play as well. It's just a great thing. You're going back, millennia to these myths.
I read somewhere, Patrick, that the Seder, as you just described, I think it may even say in the play, is a duty of each generation to retell the story. And the story is one of out of slavery to freedom.
Yeah.
In a sense, this is what the play is talking about all the time, is retelling the story about how to be free.
Yes.
So when it ends there, you have Herman and Gretel dancing together, seemingly reconciled, I guess, despite the affair, and he's come back into the family. But there is also a strong sense, isn't there, at that point, that this is the end of something. The whole idea he had at the beginning, that this turn of the century is just the beginning of some new chapter. Actually, I think, don't you feel this is a bit elegiac, that this is the end of something here?
Completely. This is the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This is the end of prosperous Vienna. It will never be like this again. I mean, in the new production, I've staged it now with the children watching glamorous couple dance, and I have their older selves watching as well, because I wanted to connect the children of 1899 and 1900 to the grown-ups they become in 1924. And it's very much the end of something. In the stage directions, Tom says that you hear the music of the waltz, but you also hear the guns of the First World War.
Aha.
So there's bombing going on, and there's violence within this beautiful waltz. So you're absolutely right. It's the end.
Another footnote, it's the Radetzky March, isn't it? Because was an unofficial anthem of Austria.
I didn't use the Radetzky March. I thought it was too familiar. So I use a bit of Sibelius. I use a bit from Valse Triste.
The reference in the text to Radetzky March I picked up was reminding me of the novel, Roth's novel, and
yeah,
seemed to be very much about the decline of empire as well, right? So it's all about the decline.
Yeah. I think Radetzky March was too jolly.
Okay, so you'd mentioned to getting the next phase in 1924, and Austria's been through the carnage of the war and has been reduced from an empire of 60 million to, I think, something like 6 million, lost all its territories, the source of its economic wealth.
Which is the beginning of Nazism. We're in Weimar Republic territory, but we're in Austria.
Yeah. So there's quite a lot of political debate, again, that goes on through that scene, isn't there, about the various factions, either socialism or nationalism?
Yeah, I mean, it's a scene that, it's a bridging scene, really, that gets you from old empire to Anschluss. And it's a necessary bridging scene. We meet lots of new people. It's quite confusing at times, figuring out who everyone is.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that.
No, sometimes in rehearsals, I'd say not so much a whodunit as a who is it. But even that has purpose, because in the end, they become just names on a list, unmarked graves. It's potent. So you have to have this multitude. And it doesn't matter if you don't figure out the family relationships. You just have to know there's lots of them and they're all interrelated. And even they get confused. In 1924 is an incredibly Stoppardian scene because it veers from high comedy and farce to intense political debate. So it's, quite funny, coarse jokes.
About circumcision and the like.
About circumcision and misunderstandings and what's it called? When you get the identity of someone wrong. I mean, it's a classic farce thing. I've forgotten the phrase. Mistaken identity, that's it. So you have that, but you also have the horror of the war, and Herman's son has got one eye and one arm and is clearly suffering from PTSD. And there's been a death in the family. Someone else has died in the war. It's and times are hard. And it's a bridge. It's the shortest scene in the play, and it leads beautifully into 1938.
Yeah, I thought it's an interesting time because I think I might have read somewhere, but it certainly seemed to make sense to me that it felt very modern by comparison to the 1899 scene we see.
Yeah.
Partly because the way people are dressed, and that one of them's now living in New York and is a flapper or whatever. And it, of course, reminded me that it's the age of modernism that followed the First World War, the fragmentation of the whole world.
Yeah.
And that the scene felt like that. It felt a bit frantic and chaotic and no longer stable and comfortable.
Yeah.
Which is a precursor to the even worse fragmentation that's going to come in 1938. Now, I thought, as you mentioned, so the 1938 scene, just set the scene for us in that. It's a really brutal scene, but where have we got to then?
Well, the other thing I want to say about 1924 is how brilliant the production team are in that scene, that in 2 minutes, they transform the set to, it feels completely different. It feels clean, feels modern, it feels light and bright. The room feels twice the size. It's a sort of minor miracle of design from Richard Hudson and lighting from Neil Austin, where you feel, you're in the same apartment, but it's 24 years later and it's like all the old has been swept away and you're in this very, very clean environment. It's a beautiful transition they make.
Well, and that happens through the whole play, doesn't it, Patrick? Because by the end, there's almost nothing on the stage, if anything.
Yeah.
So that what you said at the very beginning is this is a journey from having all this and all these people down to nothing virtually.
Yeah, the idea of the design was to go thematically with the play, which is from the many to the few. So the piano survives. There's a piano in 1899, and that survives throughout history, as it were. That goes all the way through into 1955. And one chair survives, one dining chair that has been used in the Seder. It's been used throughout the play, and it's now in a sort of tatty form, but it's there. We go into 1938 and everyone's got their bags packed. There are suitcases. The power supply has been turned off in the building. The building's been Aryanized. They've got no electricity. It's a candlelit scene. And I was very pleased when I realized that I was going to go from the brightness of 1924, a sharp spring day in Vienna, to a dark afternoon in Vienna in November, which is in fact Kristallnacht. The scene set on the night of Kristallnacht, but we're in the late afternoon and everyone's got overcoats on and scarves and hats and gloves. It's freezing cold. And sort of the thing we dread happens. The Nazis come knocking at the door. And I wouldn't want to spoil it for the listeners as to what happens, but it's sort of where the horror enters the building for the first time. And it's a very powerful, painful scene, but not without jokes either. I mean, there's still humor in it, dark humor, and life going on.
But it is very brutal to watch. Obviously the attitude of the Nazis who come into the house, it's hard to watch, hard to stomach.
Yeah.
And you already see it, as you've mentioned, their reduced circumstances. But then it's decisive, isn't it? This is it.
Yeah.
They're taking everything. There's no longer going to be a home with any security or comfort in it or any kind. The possessions are all being taken. The business is being requisitioned. And not only that, they're literally being taken to the trains, to the camps. It reminded me, I mean, there are countless of these stories, of course, Patrick, but, The Hare with Amber Eyes, Edmund Duvall's book about how his family's wealth was pillaged in 1938 in Vienna.
Yes, I know that book was very important to Tom as part of his research for this play. And also a book called Last Waltz in Vienna.
Mm-hmm.
By George, forgive me, I can't remember the surname, but it's a wonderful book.
I remember reading about some of the reading that Tom had done, so I will look that up. What it is these stories just make those historical events we know in Macrocosm all the more powerful because they tell them from a personal point of view. These are real families that got decimated. Obviously they were. but wealth didn't protect them either. Right? These are people who in the palaces of the Ringstrasse, and they lost everything.
That's absolutely right. The author's name is George Clare, and there's a book called Last Waltz in Vienna. And fans of this play will enjoy the book because it has a lot of resonance, and Tom took a lot of stuff from it, and names and atmosphere. It's a very, very important book for him.
Great, I'll look that up. There's a character in this 1938 scene, Percy, who's an English journalist. He talks about this conference. This, I thought, rings all sorts of bells, doesn't it, to this age? Because he talks about a conference where the international powers meet in Geneva to debate how many emigrating Jews they will accept in their countries, and setting limits on that. I mean, I couldn't believe that you're reading this thinking about what's going on in Afghanistan or Syria.
Absolutely. And they meet to have this very important conference about what are we going to do, and they agree to do nothing. Yeah, it's horribly resonant.
And horrifying. As Percy says, they deemed it a successful conference because they all agreed. And all they agreed was that they were going to do nothing.
Yeah.
Possibly on a lighter note, I'm intrigued about, this is diving into the weeds a bit, but there's these stream through it about mathematics. And he's always been interested, I think, in the sciences in his plays. And Ludwig, of course, is a mathematician. He's interested in a specific theory of Riemann's unsolved theory of prime numbers. I have no idea what that is. But what do you think is being suggested by including these references to mathematics in the play?
Well, for Ludwig, underneath it all, there is order, mathematical order. And this is a very important speech in the play. He has the mathematician's belief that it's not all chaos, that it's not random, that there is some shape to this universe we live in. Whereas Ernst, the doctor, he has a speech where he talks about culture will not eradicate the barbarian. And so there are arguments in the play as to, well, what is this world we live in? In the end, what is this world that will allow Nazism to happen? How did we humans do that? What are we? What is this world?
It's hard to be optimistic about this order, isn't it? We see so much chaos and breaking of any order and barbarism.
Well, I think, he's kind of clinging to the wreckage. And he has slightly lost his mind at this point. The maths is important because Nathan becomes a mathematician. Really the protagonist of the last scene of the play is the little baby who is circumcised in 1924. The young boy who is playing cat's cradle with his mathematician, not his grandfather, but an elder. And he carries the torch for maths in the play. And he's been in the camps. And in a way, his maths saves him. Something that is certain and that obeys laws and has logic and purpose. I think Tom finds maths beautiful because he finds it beautiful. And he finds it beautiful because it's like the beautiful garden in Arcadia. There are natural laws at work. Tom's always looking for what is natural, what is real, what is under this. Under all this mess, is there something that we can, maths is approximated to music in this play, but whether it's maths, gardening, Oscar Wilde, Tom loves a thing that is just by its nature good.
I think we're looking, aren't we? I think we'd rather have the rigors of the rational, of truth in the world that we live in, which seems to not value much of that now. So yes, we can see the dichotomy. It just feels that the play itself is not that optimistic, clearly, at looking at what's transpired. We come to the end. You're saying that Nathan is a survivor and somewhat bitter, of course, about this past, understandably. But then in 1955, they introduced, as you mentioned at the very beginning, the character of Leo, who was born Leopold.
He's born Leopold, but now goes under the name Leonard.
And Leonard Chamberlain, even, just to suggest a bit of...
Yeah, he's the adopted son of Percy, just as Tom was the adopted son of Major Stoppard, a very proud Englishman. And Tom treats Major Stoppard rather kindly in the play. I mean, Percy is quite a decent chap. I think Major Stoppard maybe was a bit of a stick in the mud, to put it mildly. The warmth Tom got was from his mother, who he was very close to and adored, and lived to a ripe old age and always fed him sweets. Tom has a very sweet tooth. Comes from his mother, who they called Bobby, but her name was Martha Straussler. And I said this to Tom. I said, I think this play is a love letter to your mother, because in every scene of the play, a woman is feeding a man. This happens throughout the play. There are snacks, there's food, there's cake, there's this, there's that. The men are always being fed by the women. That's how Tom grew up.
So Leo's story is very, obviously, this is not strictly autobiographical play, but there is obviously some basis to it being Tom's own life and his own family history, in that he was born in Czechoslovakia and he and his mother and father fled in 1938.
And his brother.
Into Singapore, and then, but his father was killed in 1942, and then they eventually they came to England. And Leo, similarly, escapes Vienna and is brought up in England by his stepfather, who is very British. And it's not an accident that that he ended up British, Leo, clearly. And there's some interesting treatment about what it means to be British. And as you suggested, it was quite sympathetic to his stepfather in the play. Leo says that he's proud to be British, to belong to a nation that is looked up to for fair play and parliament and freedom of everything, asylum for exiles and refugees, the Royal Navy, the royal family. It's hard to listen to that, is it not, now? I mean, he may have believed it in 1955, but it's hard to listen to that now and not think that sounds a bit ironic. Is that the intent?
Well, it's very interesting, this element of it, because I always direct the actor playing Leo to take this very seriously. And you may get laughs, the audience might laugh, but from your point of view, you believe every single second of this. And it's the same for Tom. One of his great themes is that he's very grateful that Britain took him in and educated him. And he's a very, very proud Englishman. And he kind of loves the royal family and the traditions of England, because a part of him feels foreign and a part of him feels completely English. And, as he said himself, he's a bounced Czech. It's very potent for Tom. He's aware that it might get laughs now, but the Leo of 1955, and I believe the Tom of 1955, absolutely felt this.
And there is I think that the richness of this is that underlying that there is still some truth, there are residues of truth in there, that we haven't all given up on some of these things. And as you mentioned, that apparently his stepfather used to say is that to be born an Englishman was to have drawn first prize in the lottery of life. And there's some quotes in the play that talk about that sort of accident of history, and that Leo has lived a charmed life. And I believe that Sir Tom has said that likewise, he's lived a charmed life.
Yeah.
It is just a lottery, isn't it? That way, I think to myself, as we speak, how lucky I am to have grown up in Canada rather than Afghanistan. And surely that's what you must feel if you find a safe harbor.
We're all accidents of history, all of us. And this is the horror.
It is.
This is why you might be drawn to mathematics, because we all know that how we were born, where we were born, when we were born, and who parented us, it forms us, makes us. It's accidental.
Yes, and where? It could, the events of history just overtake us, whatever. And so, yes, accidental. There's also a debate in this final scene with Leo about not just his Englishness, but his Jewishness, because he is, like Tom, as I understand it, the Jewishness has not been central to their lives. In fact, as I understand it, Sir Tom's mother wasn't explicit about this. For most of his life, he didn't really know who his entire family was and what had happened to him.
Yeah.
And likewise, Nathan is challenging Leo in the play about what his identity is. And Leo has said something along the lines that this was just a sort of minor distinction to him. It wasn't important. But you can't really echo back to the line that you can't not be a Jew, ultimately.
Yeah. This happened to Tom in the 90s. He had lunch with a relative of his who I just got a text from Tom. That's funny.
Say hello.
He had lunch with a relative of his in the 90s. He was at the National, rehearsing either Arcadia or Invention of Love. You can't remember which. And she did to him what Rosa does to Leo in the play. She drew him a family tree and said, "You're a Jew, and this is what happened to your people. But you float around as if you throw no shadow, as if you have no history." And this had a profound effect on Tom. And he went back to the Czechoslovakia and he went to visit the old sites and the old house and where his father worked. And he met a woman whose hand had been cut. Tom's father was the doctor at the Barter shoe factory, chief medic. And this woman showed Tom her scar on her hand, just as Leo has a scar on his hand, and said, "Your father did this." And Tom was profoundly moved by seeing his father's handiwork, forgive the pun. And he wrote a long article about all this in Talk magazine in 1999. 20 years later, he starts writing a play about it. This is how playwrights work. Long, long, long gestation.
It's a wonderful moment where Leo makes the connection to his past because of the scar.
Stunning. But also it's a session with Dr. Freud. I mean, it's, there is an analyst in the scene, but she's not the one who guides Leo to this, but it's recovered memory. And it's a very, very brilliant and moving sequence in the play.
It is. The play set against a huge backdrop of the largest political and moral issues of the last century, but it's also just really about family too, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a family drama in a political tragedy.
Yes. So the end of the play, we see these generations of family, and as you talked at the beginning, all those who've disappeared. And you've said, I think, somewhere that the play is about making sure people aren't forgotten.
Well, never forget. This happened. And there are people who deny it happened. And each generation needs to tell its story. All minorities need to tell their story. And it's the responsibility of each successive generation to carry it on, just like the Seder. This is part of the Jewish people's story. Always will be now.
And it's interesting because it's also the story of the macro events, but also not to forget your own history, your own family's history.
Yeah.
Because throughout we're shown, again, the connections, the deep connections, as you said, of family going back that hold us together. The grandmother in the family at the very beginning is trying to put labels on the photos in the album,
yeah,
to not lose who these people were. And at the very end, you have this beautiful tableau of the family on the stage, of all the many who have been reduced to the few, but are now ghosts that we, as you say, mustn't forget.
That's right. It's a play of remembering and forgetting. All these themes are in it. I mean, in a way, all of Tom's plays are memory plays. Travesties certainly is. Arcadia contains the memory of the past. It's a great artist recapitulating and expanding on his lifelong themes. It's a truly incredible play for anyone to write, but for a man to write it in his 80s, this much energy, this much power. I can't think of another major playwright who wrote so well in his 80s. You know, playwriting is traditionally a younger man's game.
Yeah, it's remarkable for the sweep of it, for the scale, the ambition, but also for its very personal mining of his own family history and all these convulsive events of the 20th century, but also made so personal and poignant.
Well, this is the thing. You asked me at the beginning, why did you want to direct it? Well, because I had a hunch that this was a major theatrical event. And it is.
It is. Thank you, Patrick. This has been so enlightening and wonderful to talk to you. I don't know whether we've got time, but let's just see. One of the traditions of the podcast, I'd like to ask my guests if they could recommend a play that we could talk about in a future episode. I'm bound to say that really what I dearly love to do is invite you back to talk about one of your own plays and hope that we might do that sometime. But for now, I wonder, is there another play that is a personal favorite that you'd be happy to recommend to listeners?
Well, I'm really excited to go and see The Normal Heart at the National, directed by Dominic Cook, starring Ben Daniels. I remember that play in the 80s, terribly important play. And to see what Dominic Cook does with it, and Ben Daniels, that's top of my list.
Great. Well, I'll look forward to going to that too. Thank you for that. And thank you for joining me today. I hope we can reconnect and talk about one of your plays in the future.
My pleasure. Thank you, Douglas.
As the curtain falls on the litany of those lost in the Holocaust and the poignant record of the Merz and Jakobovich families, the most powerful feeling I have is of the importance of the testimony of the past, of the retelling of our personal and collective histories. For in these stories are the foundations of our values, the values of family and freedom, as well as warnings that we must remain morally vigilant, not to perpetuate or regress to prejudices of the past. Thanks for listening. See you next time.
Thanks for listening. To listen to other episodes, to find out news about future episodes, or to leave comments about what you've heard, please visit us at www.theplaypodcast.com. You can also follow us on Facebook or on Twitter at theplaypod. You're also welcome to email plays@theplaypodcast.com to suggest plays that we could talk about in future episodes. You can also register your suggestion on the website. Thanks again, and see you next time.